Mouse on Friday.
I'm Gary Goldsmith, the uncle to the future Queen of our country, Kate Middleton.
Will Kate be watching? If she is, it'll be behind the sofa, I guess.
I'm just fascinated.
There are some families where every photograph tells the same story. Perfect smiles, perfect clothes, perfect occasions. And then, somewhere just outside the frame, there is the relative nobody quite knows what to do with. For the Middleton family, that relative was Gary Goldsmith. He was not a distant cousin. He was not some forgotten branch of the family tree. He was Kate Middleton's uncle, the younger brother of her mother, Carol Middleton. And for years his name kept appearing in British newspapers for all the wrong reasons. While Kate was carefully being introduced to royal life, Gary was building a very different public reputation. He was wealthy, outspoken, flamboyant, and unapologetically unconventional. And eventually, his private life became impossible to separate from the public story of the woman who would become Catherine, Princess of Wales. But this is not simply a story about a controversial uncle. It is a story about two completely different worlds existing inside the same family. One world was built around discretion. The other seemed to thrive on attention. One depended on carefully controlled public appearances. The other produced headlines. And when Kate's relationship with Prince William became serious, those differences suddenly mattered. Because marrying into the British royal family does not mean marrying into a perfect family. Far from it. The Windsors had their own scandals, rivalries, divorces, betrayals, and controversies. But Kate's family was different. The Middletons were not born into aristocracy. They had built their way upward. Kate's mother, Carol Middleton, came from a working-class background and eventually built a successful business with her husband, Michael. Their children grew up in a comfortable environment, attended prestigious schools, and eventually moved into Britain's highest social circles. Kate's relationship with William transformed the family's public profile completely. Suddenly, everything connected to the Middletons could become news, and that included Gary. Born in London in 1965, Gary was Carol's younger brother. He eventually entered the world of IT recruitment and became extremely successful. According to later reports, he made millions from his business career, reportedly receiving around £17 million when he sold his shares in an IT recruitment company in 2005. He could have simply lived a wealthy private life. Instead, Gary developed a reputation for being something much more colourful. He owned an extravagant villa in Ibiza. He enjoyed nightlife. He cultivated a larger-than-life personality. And unlike most people connected to the royal family, he did not seem particularly interested in behaving like a royal. Then came 2009. Kate was already in a serious relationship with Prince William. The possibility of a future royal wedding was becoming increasingly real. And suddenly, Gary Goldsmith became the subject of a major newspaper sting. Undercover reporters from the News of the World recorded conversations with him at his Ibiza home. The resulting story alleged that he offered drugs and discussed arranging prostitutes. The allegations created an uncomfortable problem for the Middleton family, because this was not happening in isolation. Kate was no longer simply Michael and Carol Middleton's daughter. She was the girlfriend of the future King of Britain, and anything involving her family could potentially become a royal embarrassment. The contrast was almost surreal. While Kate's public image was becoming increasingly polished, her uncle was being portrayed in newspapers as a wealthy Ibiza playboy with a taste for excess. It was exactly the kind of story royal advisors would normally want nowhere near a future queen. Yet Gary did something that made the situation even more complicated. He did not disappear completely. He continued to speak publicly. He continued to live an extravagant lifestyle. And, perhaps most importantly, he remained part of the family. Kate did not simply erase him from her life. In fact, despite the controversy, Gary was ultimately allowed to attend Kate and William's wedding in 2011. That decision tells us something important. The royal family could control official appearances. They could control palace statements. They could control who appeared beside the bride during a historic ceremony. But they could not completely control the family members connected to the bride. And Gary Goldsmith was one of those people. For the Middletons, the problem was not necessarily that Gary was a criminal mastermind or some hidden enemy of the monarchy. The reality was much more ordinary and perhaps more uncomfortable. He was a member of the family who repeatedly attracted attention, and that was precisely what the royal system tries to avoid. The monarchy survives on image, privacy, discretion, restraint. Gary Goldsmith seemed to operate according to a different set of rules. He was the kind of person who could walk into a room and become the story, and that made him a particularly awkward relative for someone preparing to become a senior member of the British royal family. But the 2009 scandal was only the beginning, because years later, another incident would place Gary's name in the headlines again, and this time the story would be much more serious. It would involve police, a court, his fourth wife, and a conviction that would permanently complicate the image of Kate Middleton's supposedly ordinary, respectable family. But before that happened, there was a strange period when Gary appeared to have successfully reinvented himself. He was no longer simply the embarrassing uncle from Ibiza. He became something else, a wealthy businessman, a colorful family character, a man who claimed he had changed. And for a while, it seemed the controversy might finally be behind him. Until it wasn't. Because when you are related to a future queen, the past has a way of coming back. And Gary Goldsmith's past was about to become impossible to ignore. For a man who had spent years enjoying the reputation of being the family's wild uncle, Gary Goldsmith had one thing going for him. He was successful, very successful. Long before his name became associated with royal scandal, Goldsmith had made his fortune in the world of IT recruitment. The money changed his lifestyle, and his lifestyle changed the way the public saw him. He owned an extravagant property in Ibiza. He enjoyed expensive holidays, nightlife, and the kind of social life that seemed completely disconnected from the quiet, respectable image the Middleton family was increasingly trying to project. And that contrast became even more striking after Kate's relationship with Prince William entered the public spotlight. Suddenly, Gary was no longer simply Gary. He was Kate Middleton's uncle. Every mistake became more interesting. Every photograph became more valuable. Every careless comment had the potential to become a royal story. And Gary had already learned just how quickly that could happen. The 2009 newspaper sting had exposed conversations in which he appeared to discuss drugs and his connections to the royal family. For the Middleton family, the timing could hardly have been worse. Kate was preparing for life at the centre of Britain's constitutional monarchy. Her public image was becoming increasingly important. She was being watched by millions of people who knew almost nothing about the private Middleton family. And then there was Gary, the eccentric millionaire uncle, the Ibiza businessman, the man newspapers could describe as the family's bad boy. Yet there was another side to him that rarely fitted the headlines. He was genuinely close to his family. He spoke proudly about Kate. He attended her wedding to Prince William in 2011. He was also present when Kate's sister Pippa married James Matthews in 2017. And despite everything that had been written about him, Gary remained connected to the Middleton family. That distinction matters, because it is easy to turn a controversial relative into a cartoon villain. The reality was much more complicated. Kate did not choose her uncle. The palace did not choose him either. He was simply part of the family she was born into. And when Kate married William, the royal family inherited something they could never completely control: her relatives. The royal household could decide who received official invitations. It could control press statements. It could manage royal engagements. But it could not rewrite a family tree. And Gary Goldsmith was permanently written into that tree. Then, in October 2017, everything changed. Kate was now the Duchess of Cambridge. Prince William was second in line to the throne. Their children were becoming increasingly important members of the royal succession. The Middleton family had spent years under intense media attention, and then police were called to a London street. It was around 1:20 in the morning on October 13th, 2017. Gary Goldsmith and his fourth wife, Julianne, had been returning home after attending a charity event. What happened next became a matter for the courts. Police charged Goldsmith with assault by beating. The alleged victim was his wife. The story immediately exploded across Britain's newspapers. This was no longer an embarrassing story about an eccentric millionaire. This involved an allegation of domestic violence, and the connection to Kate Middleton made the story enormous. Goldsmith initially faced the charge in court. The case proceeded. Then came the evidence. The court heard that Goldsmith had been drinking. The prosecution said an argument had taken place between the couple, and a taxi driver who had witnessed the incident described Goldsmith striking his wife. Goldsmith eventually pleaded guilty to assault by beating. The court heard that the blow caused Julianne to fall to the ground. The details were ugly, and suddenly, the Middleton family's most controversial relative was no longer merely a tabloid curiosity. He was a convicted offender. In November 2017, Westminster Magistrates Court fined Goldsmith £5,000. He was also given a 12-month community order and ordered to complete rehabilitation sessions. He avoided prison, but the damage to his public reputation was already done. And for the royal family, the timing was particularly uncomfortable. Because by then, Kate was not simply William's girlfriend. She was a senior working royal. She was the mother of future heirs. Her family was increasingly viewed as an extension of the royal institution itself. And yet one of her closest relatives had just been convicted of assaulting his wife. There was no way to make that story disappear. No clever palace photograph could fix it. No carefully written royal statement could change the court record. And perhaps most importantly, the incident demonstrated something the royal family had known for years. There was a fundamental difference between controlling the monarchy's image and controlling the people connected to it. Gary Goldsmith was not a member of the royal family. He did not hold a royal title. He did not represent the crown. But his relationship to Kate meant that his actions could still become part of the public conversation surrounding her. And that was the problem. The monarchy could distance itself from him, but it could never completely remove him. Because every time a newspaper wrote his name, it usually needed another name to explain who he was. Kate Middleton's uncle. That connection was the story. And the story was about to become even more complicated. Because after his conviction, Goldsmith did something that would become a recurring pattern in his public life. He tried to explain himself. He wanted people to understand his side. He wanted to show that the man portrayed in the newspapers was not the whole story, and that would eventually bring him back into the spotlight. Not because the palace invited him, not because Kate needed him, but because Gary Goldsmith had something the royal family had spent generations learning to suppress: a willingness to speak. The problem with scandals involving royal relatives is that they rarely end when the courtroom closes. The sentence may be finished. The headlines may disappear, but the connection remains. And for Gary Goldsmith, the 2017 conviction did not erase him from the Middleton family. If anything, it made his relationship with Kate more interesting to the public, because the obvious question was now unavoidable. What did Kate think about all of this? The palace did not provide a dramatic public response. There was no lengthy statement from Kensington Palace explaining the family's position, and that silence was significant. Royal families rarely comment on private family matters unless they absolutely have to. The less they say, the less there is for the press to work with. But silence does not mean that nothing happened behind closed doors. Goldsmith later spoke about his relationship with Kate, and insisted that she had remained supportive. He portrayed himself as a man who had made a serious mistake, accepted responsibility, and wanted to move forward. That distinction mattered, because there was a difference between saying that someone had never done anything wrong and saying that someone had done something wrong, accepted the consequences, and remained part of the family. The second version was much harder for the public to process, especially when the family belonged to the future queen. Yet there was another reason Gary's story continued to attract attention. He was not afraid of the media. In fact, at times he seemed almost comfortable with it. He gave interviews. He spoke about Kate. He discussed family life. And occasionally, he revealed details about the Middletons that the palace itself would never discuss. That made him unusual. Royal insiders are usually trained to say very little. Goldsmith was not. He had no official position to protect. He was a businessman, a family member, and a private citizen. That gave him considerably more freedom, but it also made him potentially dangerous from a public relations perspective, because a relative who speaks freely can reveal more than an official spokesperson ever would. And the Middleton family had become one of Britain's most closely watched families. There was enormous public curiosity about Kate's parents, about her siblings, about the family's wealth, about their relationship with William, and about what life was really like behind the polished photographs. Goldsmith occasionally offered glimpses into that world. He talked about family gatherings. He described Kate as a normal person. He spoke about William, and he sometimes presented himself as the protective uncle who wanted to defend his niece. But that created another contradiction. The same man whose behavior had once created embarrassment could also become one of Kate's loudest defenders. And that contradiction followed him for years. Then came another chapter. In 2024, Goldsmith entered the spotlight again when he appeared on the British reality television program Celebrity Big Brother. For most people, appearing on a reality show is simply a career decision. For the uncle of Catherine, Princess of Wales, it was something else. It was a reminder that the Middleton family still had a relative who was willing to step directly into the entertainment world, and television cameras were about to follow him around. For the royal family, that was an uncomfortable proposition. The modern monarchy depends heavily on controlled visibility. Members of the royal family decide when to appear. They decide what events to attend. They decide what causes to support. They are surrounded by advisors who carefully consider their words, clothing, photographs, and public behavior. Goldsmith had none of those restrictions. He could talk about whatever he wanted. He could joke. He could complain. He could discuss family stories. And he could potentially mention Kate. The possibility alone made him newsworthy. When Goldsmith entered the Celebrity Big Brother house, British newspapers immediately focused on his relationship with the Princess of Wales. He was no longer just the controversial uncle from the past. He was now a television personality whose connection to one of the world's most famous women was part of his public identity. And then something unexpected happened. Instead of constantly attacking the royal family, Goldsmith often appeared protective of Kate. He spoke positively about his niece. He presented her as grounded and hard-working. He rejected some of the more extreme portrayals of her in the media. And in doing so, he demonstrated the strange position he occupied within the Middleton family. He could be embarrassing. He could be controversial. He could attract headlines. But he could also be loyal. And loyalty is complicated when it comes to families. A person can make serious mistakes and still be loved by relatives. A person can embarrass the family and still be invited to weddings. A person can damage the family's public image and still receive a phone call on Christmas morning. That is what makes the story of Gary Goldsmith more complicated than the simple phrase, "the uncle the palace kept quiet about." There was never a complete disappearance. There was never an official declaration that he no longer belonged to the family. Instead, there was something much more ordinary: distance, silence, and careful separation. Kate could continue her royal duties. Gary could live his own life, and the two worlds could exist side by side without necessarily colliding, at least most of the time. But then the biggest question remained. Why was Gary Goldsmith so important to the story at all? Because his existence exposed something the public rarely gets to see: the difference between a royal family and a real family. Royal photographs show perfection. Real families contain difficult relatives. They contain successful people, failures, arguments, mistakes, reconciliations, and people who refuse to behave exactly as everyone else expects. Kate Middleton's family was no different. The woman who would eventually become Princess of Wales did not come from a flawless aristocratic dynasty. She came from a family with its own complicated history, and Gary Goldsmith was one of the clearest examples. But there was still another layer to the story. Because by the time Kate had become one of the most recognizable women in the world, Goldsmith's role was changing again. He was no longer simply a scandalous relative. He was becoming something much more useful to the media: a source, a defender, a personality, and sometimes a person willing to say what others close to Kate would never say publicly. That would become especially important when the Princess of Wales herself disappeared from public view, and when speculation surrounding her became almost impossible to control, because in that moment, the world would once again look toward the people around Kate, and Gary Goldsmith would have something to say. By early 2024, Kate Middleton was facing something very different from the scandals that had surrounded her uncle. This time, she was not the source of the controversy. She was the subject of it. On January 17th, Kensington Palace announced that Kate had been admitted to hospital for planned abdominal surgery. The palace said the operation had been successful and that she was expected to remain in hospital for up to 2 weeks. It also made clear that she was unlikely to return to public duties until after Easter. At first, the announcement seemed straightforward. A senior royal had undergone surgery. She needed time to recover. The palace had provided an explanation. But something happened that the royal institution could not completely control. The internet began asking questions. Why had the palace revealed so little? Why was the recovery expected to take so long? Why was Prince William reducing some of his own public duties? And, perhaps most importantly, why was there no photograph of Kate after the operation? The speculation grew rapidly. Social media turned an ordinary royal health announcement into a global mystery. Conspiracy theories appeared. Rumors multiplied. People analyzed photographs. They examined old videos. They searched for clues in official statements. And eventually, the pressure became enormous. Then came March 2024. Kensington Palace released a photograph of Kate with her 3 children for Mother's Day in Britain. It was supposed to be reassuring. Instead, it created another crisis. Several major international photo agencies issued a kill notice over the image, saying it had been manipulated. The palace later acknowledged that Kate had edited the photograph. She apologized and said she sometimes experimented with editing, like many amateur photographers. But the controversy did not disappear. It became bigger, and this was where Gary Goldsmith suddenly found himself back in the middle of the story. He was now a contestant on Celebrity Big Brother. Millions of people were watching, and the cameras were following a man who happened to be the uncle of the woman at the center of one of the world's biggest media storms. Goldsmith was asked about Kate. He defended her. He criticized the speculation surrounding her, and he urged people to give her privacy. That might sound harmless, but because of who he was, almost anything he said could become a headline. A normal family member saying, "She's fine, leave her alone," would probably attract little attention. Kate's uncle saying it on national television was different. Every word carried additional weight. The public wanted information. The media wanted information, and the palace was saying very little. So Goldsmith became an unexpected source of reassurance. But he also had to walk a narrow line. If he revealed too much, he could create another problem for Kate. If he said too little, people would assume he was hiding something. And if he defended her too strongly, his words could become part of the speculation. This was the strange position he had occupied for years. He was close enough to Kate to be interesting, but not official enough to speak for her. He was family, not the palace, and that distinction became extremely important, because the public sometimes treats relatives of famous people as unofficial spokespeople. But family members do not necessarily know everything, and even when they do know something, they may not be free to discuss it. In Kate's case, privacy was particularly sensitive. She had spent years being photographed everywhere. Her clothes were analyzed. Her expressions were analyzed. Her children were photographed. Her marriage was analyzed. Even ordinary moments could become international news. Now she was recovering from surgery, and the attention had become something far more intense. Goldsmith appeared frustrated by the speculation. He defended Kate as a private person who deserved time away from the cameras. And in doing so, he revealed another side of their relationship. The controversial uncle was not trying to embarrass her. He was trying to protect her. That did not erase his past. It did not erase the 2009 scandal. It did not erase his 2017 conviction. But it demonstrated something important about family dynamics. People are rarely one thing. Gary Goldsmith could be reckless and protective. He could be controversial and loyal. He could create headlines and then complain about the media attention surrounding his family. And perhaps that contradiction explains why the palace could never simply treat him as an enemy. He was still Kate's uncle, still part of her family, still someone she had known long before she became a princess. But the controversy surrounding Kate was about to reach a level that even Goldsmith could not control. On March 22, 2024, Kate appeared in a video message. She revealed that tests following her abdominal surgery had found cancer and that she had begun preventative chemotherapy. The announcement transformed the entire story. Suddenly, the months of speculation looked very different. What had been treated by some as a mystery was revealed to be a deeply personal medical crisis, and the world reacted. Messages of support came from political leaders, celebrities, organizations, and members of the public. The Princess of Wales asked for privacy for herself, William, and their children. And once again, the importance of discretion became obvious. For months, the royal family had been under pressure to explain Kate's absence. But the truth was something that could not responsibly be turned into entertainment. It was her health, her family, her children, her private life. And perhaps that is the biggest irony in the story of Gary Goldsmith. For years, he had represented everything the royal system usually tries to keep away from the spotlight. He was outspoken. He was unconventional. He had a history of scandal. He had made mistakes publicly. But when Kate faced one of the most difficult periods of her life, even her outspoken uncle understood the basic rule. Some things should remain private. And that was when the public began seeing Gary Goldsmith differently. Not necessarily as the villain, not necessarily as the hero, but as something far more complicated. A member of Kate's family, a man with a troubled public history, a man who had made serious mistakes, and a man who, when his niece needed protection from public speculation, appeared willing to defend her. Yet there was still one question hanging over the entire story. If Gary Goldsmith had been such a controversial figure for so many years, why was he still so close to the Middleton family? And why did Kate continue to treat him as family, despite everything that had happened? The answer may have less to do with the palace, and more to do with something the palace has never been able to control: blood. There is a temptation, when looking at a family connected to royalty, to divide everyone into heroes and villains. But real families do not work that way. Gary Goldsmith is a perfect example. His history contains genuine controversy. He was involved in the 2009 Ibiza scandal. He was later convicted of assaulting his wife, and yet he remained part of Kate Middleton's family. That raises an uncomfortable question. Why didn't the family simply cut him off? The answer is probably much simpler than the headlines suggest. Because families are complicated. Kate knew Gary long before she became a princess. He was her mother's brother. He belonged to the world she grew up in, long before cameras followed her everywhere. And when someone becomes famous, their relatives do not suddenly stop being relatives. They may become embarrassing. They may become difficult. They may even make serious mistakes. But family relationships do not automatically disappear. That is something the public often forgets. The Middleton family was never a royal family. They did not grow up under the same rules. Carol and Michael Middleton built their own success. Their children grew up in a comparatively normal family environment. Then Kate met William. And suddenly, that ordinary family was being examined as though it had always been part of the establishment. Every relative became interesting. Every old photograph could become a newspaper story. Every mistake could be connected back to Kate. Gary simply happened to be the most dramatic example. And that is why calling him the uncle the palace kept quiet about is slightly misleading. The palace did not need to hide him. He was already known. The real story was that the royal institution had to learn how to live with a relative it could not control. There was no royal title to remove from him, no official position to take away, no palace department managing his behavior. Gary could live his life however he wanted, and Kate had to live with the consequences of being related to him. That is a very different problem from having a scandalous member of the royal family, because Gary was not a working royal. He was a private citizen. His mistakes were his own. But newspapers could always connect those mistakes to the woman who would eventually become one of Britain's most important public figures. That connection made him valuable to the press. And it also made him potentially useful to Kate, because when the official royal household could not speak freely, a family member could sometimes provide another perspective. Gary's appearances in the media demonstrated that perfectly. He could talk about Kate as a niece rather than as a princess. He could describe the person behind the title, and that gave the public something the palace rarely provides, a glimpse of Kate's family life from the inside. But there was a danger in that too. The closer a relative gets to the media, the greater the possibility that private family information becomes public. And the Middleton family had spent years trying to maintain a relatively normal family life, despite Kate's extraordinary position. That balance became even harder after the death of Queen Elizabeth II and the accession of King Charles III. Kate became the Princess of Wales. William became the heir apparent. Their children moved another step closer to the throne. The family's public importance increased dramatically, which meant that even the smallest controversy involving a Middleton relative could attract international attention. Gary's story therefore became part of a much larger question. How much of a royal's family should the public be allowed to see? The answer from the palace has traditionally been clear. Very little. The public sees the official version. The family sees everything else. And Gary Goldsmith existed in the space between those two worlds. He was close enough to know the family, but independent enough to speak for himself. That made him unusual. It also made him unpredictable. And perhaps that is why his story has remained interesting for so long. Not because he was secretly controlling anything, not because he was some hidden threat to the monarchy, but because he represented something the palace could never completely eliminate. Imperfection. Kate Middleton could become a princess. She could become the future queen. She could stand beside William at major state occasions and represent Britain around the world. but she would still have a family. And families come with history. Some of that history is beautiful. Some of it is embarrassing. And some of it follows you no matter how powerful you become. Gary Goldsmith's story is ultimately a reminder of that. Behind the palaces, titles, ceremonies, and carefully controlled photographs are ordinary human relationships. And sometimes, the relative you would least want the world to notice is precisely the one everyone notices. For Kate, that relative was her uncle. And for the palace, the challenge was never really about hiding him. It was about keeping his story separate from hers. Because Kate had spent decades building her own public identity, Gary Goldsmith had built his own. And the two stories happened to share the same family tree. By this point, Gary Goldsmith had become something of a contradiction. He was one of the most controversial people connected to Kate Middleton. But he was also one of the people willing to defend her most publicly. And that contradiction tells us something important about the Middleton family. They were never as polished as the royal institution. They didn't need to be. Kate did. That was the difference. Once she married Prince William, Kate's behavior was no longer judged only as the behavior of a daughter, wife, or mother. It was judged as the behavior of a future queen. Her uncle did not have that burden. He could make mistakes. He could speak freely. He could live an unconventional life. And when the newspapers criticized him, the consequences were largely his own. For Kate, the consequences could be much larger. Every family controversy could potentially become a royal controversy. This is why the Middleton family became so careful about public appearances. Carol and Michael rarely sought the kind of publicity that celebrities chase. Pippa became famous in her own right, but generally maintained a controlled public image. James Middleton built his own business career and largely stayed outside royal drama. Gary was different. He seemed much more comfortable with attention, and that made him the family's unpredictable element. Still, there is an important distinction between being unpredictable and being deliberately harmful. There is no evidence that Gary was secretly working against Kate or the monarchy. In fact, his public comments often suggested the opposite. He appeared protective of his niece. He spoke proudly about her. And when criticism became intense, he sometimes pushed back. That is why the idea of a secret palace campaign to erase him from history doesn't quite fit the evidence. The reality was less dramatic. The palace simply had no reason to make Gary Goldsmith part of the official royal story. He was not a prince. He was not an advisor. He was not a representative of the crown. He was Kate's uncle. And that was enough. The royal institution could simply avoid giving him a platform. If journalists wanted to write about him, they could. But he did not need to appear in official royal photographs or participate in royal duties. That separation allowed Kate to maintain her public identity while Gary continued living his own life. But the relationship became particularly interesting whenever Kate faced criticism, because Gary's instinct appeared to be very different from the palace's. The palace responds with silence. Gary responds by talking. The palace protects information. Gary sometimes provides it. The palace avoids confrontation. Gary has never seemed especially afraid of it. In a strange way, he represented the opposite of the traditional royal communication strategy. And perhaps that explains why the media kept coming back to him. There was always the possibility that he might say something unexpected. But there was another reason his story remained relevant. Kate's rise had transformed the Middleton family from a private family into a public institution. That transformation was never something they had planned from birth. They became famous because one of their daughters fell in love with the future king. And suddenly, ordinary family history became royal history. That is an enormous change. Imagine having a family member become one of the most photographed women on earth. Your childhood stories become interesting. Your weddings become news. Your parents become public figures. Your siblings become celebrities. And your controversial uncle becomes a recurring newspaper character. The Middletons could never completely return to ordinary life. Gary certainly could not. But perhaps the most revealing part of the story is that Kate never needed to pretend she came from a perfect family. She didn't. Neither does William. Neither does Charles. Neither did Queen Elizabeth II. Royal families are still families. They have complicated relatives. They have disagreements. They have people who make mistakes. The difference is that millions of people are watching. And when the person at the center of that family is destined to become queen, those imperfections become headlines. Gary Goldsmith simply became one of the clearest examples. His story was never really about the palace hiding a secret. It was about the uncomfortable reality of marrying into royalty. You don't marry only a person. You inherit their world, their traditions, their history, their friends, their enemies, and, sometimes, their difficult relatives. Kate inherited all of it when she married William. But she also brought her own family into the royal world, and Gary Goldsmith came with them. The palace could control how often he appeared. It could avoid mentioning him. It could refuse to give his controversies an official platform. But it could not erase the family connection. And perhaps it never needed to. Because Kate's greatest protection was not pretending that her family was perfect. It was allowing her own record to speak louder than theirs. For more than a decade, Kate built a public reputation based on discipline, charity work, motherhood, and royal duty. Gary built a very different reputation. The two could exist separately, and ultimately, that may have been the solution. Not secrecy, not exile, just distance. But there was still one final question. When the cameras disappear and the royal titles are removed from the conversation, what does Kate actually see when she looks at her uncle? A liability? An embarrassment? Or simply family? The answer may never be publicly known, and perhaps that is exactly how it should be, because whatever happens inside that family belongs to them. The public can know the scandals, the court records, the headlines, the photographs, but there is a line between knowing someone's story and knowing their private relationship, and that line is one the royal family has always guarded carefully. Gary Goldsmith crossed that line several times in public, but Kate never had to. And that difference may explain why, despite everything, he remained part of her story. By now, the story of Gary Goldsmith had become less about what he had done, and more about what his existence revealed about the family Kate Middleton came from. Because the closer Kate moved toward the throne, the more people wanted to understand the woman behind the royal image. And that meant looking beyond Kensington Palace, back to Berkshire, back to the Middleton family, back to the people who knew Kate before the world did. Gary was one of those people. He had known her when she was simply Carol Middleton's niece, before the wedding, before the titles, before the millions of photographs, and that gave him a perspective that royal officials could never have. But it also created a strange contradiction. The world wanted to hear from people who knew Kate personally. The palace wanted those same people to remain private. Gary's personality made that balance particularly difficult. He was willing to talk, and sometimes he was willing to talk when others would have stayed silent. That was one reason his name repeatedly returned whenever Kate became the subject of intense media attention. But there was another side to this. The public sometimes assumes that relatives of famous people must have special access to everything happening behind closed doors. They usually don't. Being someone's uncle does not mean knowing every detail of their life, and being related to a future queen does not make someone a royal insider. Gary was family. That was his connection. Nothing more official than that. And perhaps that is why the palace never needed to make a dramatic statement about him. The simplest strategy was the most effective one. Don't make him part of the institution. Let him remain a private citizen. If he created controversy, it was his controversy. If he gave an interview, it was his interview. If he defended Kate, It was his decision. And if journalists wanted to connect him to the Princess of Wales, they could do so because of the family relationship. But Kate herself did not have to participate. That separation became especially important as the royal family entered a new era. William and Kate were no longer simply a young royal couple. They were preparing for the future. Their children were growing up under extraordinary public attention, and every aspect of their family life carried more significance. For Kate, maintaining boundaries became essential. Her uncle's story demonstrated why. One person's actions could create headlines for an entire family. But Kate's response was remarkably consistent. She did not publicly attack him. She did not publicly defend every decision he made. She simply continued with her own life. That may have been the most effective response possible, because eventually the public had to judge Kate, not on her uncle, not on her parents, not on her siblings, and not on anyone else in her family. That distinction is important when looking back at the years of headlines surrounding Gary Goldsmith. His controversies were real. His conviction was real. The embarrassment was real. But so was the fact that he remained a member of the family. Both things can be true at the same time. A family can reject someone's behavior without rejecting the person entirely. A niece can disagree with her uncle without publicly declaring war on him. And a royal household can distance itself from a relative without pretending that person never existed. That is probably the most accurate way to understand Gary Goldsmith's position. He was never a secret prince. He was never a hidden power behind Kate. And there is no evidence that the palace was secretly terrified of him. He was simply an unconventional member of a family that suddenly found itself living under a microscope. And that microscope changed everything. Before Kate married William, Gary could be controversial and still remain relatively obscure. After Kate became a senior royal, the same behavior could become international news. That is the price of proximity to power. And perhaps Gary's biggest mistake was not understanding just how valuable that proximity had become to the media. For journalists, Kate Middleton's uncle was far more interesting than simply Gary Goldsmith. His identity became inseparable from hers. Even when he was discussing his own life, the royal connection was never far away. That is why his story continued to appear whenever the public became curious about Kate's private world. But there is a final irony. The man who attracted so much attention because of his connection to Kate could never become more important than Kate herself. Whatever Gary said, whatever newspapers printed, whatever scandals surrounded him, Kate continued building her own reputation. She became one of the most recognizable women in Britain, then one of the most recognizable women in the world, and eventually the Princess of Wales. Her uncle's controversies became footnotes in a much larger story, but they remained interesting because they showed something that official royal photographs rarely reveal. The people surrounding the crown are not perfect. They never have been, and perhaps they never will be. Behind every polished royal portrait is a complicated family tree. There are relatives who behave brilliantly, relatives who disappear from public life, relatives who make mistakes, and relatives who occasionally become headlines themselves. Gary Goldsmith was one of those relatives. The difference was that his niece became future queen, and that made everything he did more visible than it otherwise would have been. Which brings us back to the question that started this entire story. Was Gary Goldsmith really the uncle the palace kept quiet about? Not exactly. The evidence suggests something much less mysterious. The palace did not need to hide him. It simply had no reason to put him at the center of the royal story. And Gary himself kept stepping into the spotlight. Sometimes because of controversy, sometimes because of his own choices, and sometimes because he wanted to defend the woman who happened to be his niece. The real story is therefore not about a secret being buried. It is about the enormous gap between a private family and a royal institution. And once Kate crossed that gap, Every member of her family had to live with the consequences. There is something strangely revealing about Gary Goldsmith's place in Kate Middleton's story. He was never the most important person in her life. He was never a member of the royal family. He never held a royal title. He never stood beside the king as an official representative of the crown. And yet, his name kept returning. Because sometimes the people closest to a famous person tell us more about that person's world than the official photographs ever can. Gary Goldsmith was part of Kate's life before she became Catherine, Princess of Wales. Before the wedding, before the titles, before the palace, before millions of people knew her name. He was simply her uncle. And then everything changed. Kate's relationship with Prince William transformed the Middleton family from a private British family into one of the most watched families in the country. Suddenly, their successes mattered. Their mistakes mattered. Their history mattered. And Gary's history became impossible for newspapers to ignore. The 2009 Ibiza scandal followed him. His 2017 conviction followed him. His appearances in the media followed him. But none of those things became Kate's identity. That distinction is important, because it would be unfair to judge a person by every mistake made by their relatives. Kate did not choose her family tree. She inherited it. Just as William inherited his, just as Charles inherited his, and just as every royal generation inherits the complicated history that came before it. The difference is that the Middletons entered this world from the outside. They were not raised knowing how to survive royal scrutiny. They had to learn. And Gary Goldsmith, perhaps more than anyone else, demonstrated how difficult that could be. He was too unconventional to fit neatly into the royal image, too outspoken to disappear completely, and too closely related to Kate to become irrelevant. So the family found the only realistic solution: distance. Kate continued her royal duties. The palace continued its carefully controlled communication, and Gary continued living his own life. Sometimes that life produced headlines. Sometimes he defended his niece. Sometimes he simply became another reminder that behind the polished royal image was an ordinary family with extraordinary circumstances. That may be the real story here. Not that the palace secretly hid an uncle, but that the palace could never completely control him. And perhaps it never needed to, because Kate's own reputation became strong enough to stand independently. She became known for her work, her discipline, her charity campaigns, her role as a mother, and eventually her position as Princess of Wales. Gary's controversies could attract attention, but they could not define her. And that is where the story ultimately ends. Not with a secret, not with a conspiracy, but with a very ordinary truth. Royal families are still families. They have complicated relatives. They have people who make mistakes. They have people who embarrass them. They have people they love despite those mistakes. And they have private relationships that the public may never fully understand. Gary Goldsmith happened to be one of those relatives. His story was dramatic enough to make headlines, but it was never powerful enough to change Kate's path. If anything, it reminds us how carefully Kate had to separate her private world from her public responsibility. The world saw the princess. Her family saw Kate, and those are not necessarily the same person. Perhaps that is why the phrase, "the uncle the palace kept quiet about," is so tempting. It sounds like a secret. It suggests something hidden behind palace walls. But the reality is more interesting because it is more human. There was no need for a grand cover-up. There was simply a controversial relative, a famous niece, and an institution determined to keep the two worlds as separate as possible. Gary Goldsmith remained Gary Goldsmith. Kate Middleton became Catherine, Princess of Wales. And somewhere between those two identities is the complicated story of a family that never expected the entire world to be watching. Because when a private family becomes part of the monarchy, privacy becomes almost impossible. Every relative becomes part of the story. Every scandal becomes a potential headline. Every family photograph can become a piece of history. And every mistake can follow the family for decades. Gary Goldsmith's story is therefore not really about a man the palace wanted people to forget. It is about something much bigger, the impossibility of choosing your relatives, and the impossibility of completely escaping their history once you become part of the world's most famous family. Kate may one day become queen. When that happens, the Middleton name will be permanently written into British royal history. And so, whether anyone likes it or not, Gary Goldsmith will be somewhere inside that history too. Not as a king, not as a royal advisor, not as a figure of power, simply as Kate's uncle, a complicated man from a complicated family. And perhaps that is the most uncomfortable lesson of all. Behind every palace door, there is still a family. And behind every perfect royal photograph, there are people who are anything but perfect. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.